take one, Mark.
It's really Mark Salter, and I just call him whenever I need to know what's going on with McCain. So. Well, he was looking around after winning re-election in 2009, or no, 2008. So John won re-election to the Senate in 2008 and started thinking about running for president. A lot of people around him at the time were big supporters of his. They'd been a core team for some time, but didn't have much national experience. And so they were looking for somebody who had been around a few presidential elections. And so I started getting calls from some of the folks on the McCain team who knew me. I didn't really know McCain that well. I'm sorry, in 98, yeah. So anyway, in 98, they started looking around for somebody who had a little bit more presidential experience, and I'd been on a number of presidential campaigns since 1980 with Reagan, and so some of my friends who were part of the McCain core group, Greg Stevens for one, who was his media consultant, called me up and said, "Hey, what do you think of John McCain running for president?" When I got done laughing, I told him, I think I'm going to probably be hooking up with somebody else. At that time, I'd just come off of the 96 Dole campaign where I had been deputy manager and wanted to run my own show and thought that Elizabeth Dole had a shot at being president of the United States. I thought I'd be pretty keen to put a woman up in the Republican Party for president. And so I was running along that trajectory. Everyone knew that George W. Bush would be the guy to beat, but the question would be who would be the person to challenge him, and I thought Elizabeth had the chops for that. Long story short, over the course of quite some time, Senator McCain and his team did an extraordinarily good job of talking me into joining his team. And so when I did, it was flat out from late 1999 all the way through 2000. Boom, we were off to the races as a presidential campaign. I'd heard of John's POW experience. I knew him as a congressman. In 1984, I actually ran delegate selection for Reagan's re-election and had to deal with him in Arizona when he was there as a congressman, putting the delegation together. He was Bob Dole's best friend, is Bob Dole's best friend, and so I dealt with him a little bit when I was helping to run the Dole campaign. He came on in a general election and basically was on the plane with Dole for most of the campaign. But I didn't really have a personal relationship with him in any way. And it was really through some of these team members who said, you know, we want you to come in and be our manager. One, to have your colleagues say they want you to be their boss was impressive to me. But when I started getting to know Senator McCain, he'd start calling me up on weekends. Hey, I'm going to be on Meet the Press this weekend. What do you think I ought to say? And I say, well, don't ask me. I'm not even for you. But he was very open, very easy, and he wanted to do politics a different way. He wanted a different kind of campaign. He didn't want business as usual. He saw the issues with the Dole campaign that I saw. We agreed on that. And I think ultimately that was what attracted each other to doing the campaign together, and that was we wanted to try something new and different. And boy, in 2000, did we ever get it. Campaign manager is a bunch of different jobs, right? There's a job of running the day-to-day operations of the campaign, making sure that the strategists have the information they need to give the advice so that they can be converted into good tactics, whether it's the schedule or the media or the ground game, political ground game. And the manager has to make all that seamlessly work together and at the same time make sure you have enough money that's getting raised and controls on the money being spent. So you're a multi-headed beast as a campaign manager, but that doesn't fulfill really the job requirements. One of the other jobs that a campaign manager has, especially in an intensely personal campaign like a presidential campaign, is dealing with the family. Nobody's family is used to a presidential campaign, and yet they're all thrust into it. And so I would say probably the most rewarding experience that I've had over all this period of time has been getting to know the McCain family, getting to know John's wife, Cindy, and the kids, because they all play an integral role in the campaign and the life of the candidate, which is intersecting with a campaign, sometimes at loggerheads, sometimes very seamlessly. But at the end of the day, the family matters. Really starting the day in early 1999, when I agreed to be the campaign manager for his 2000 election, we've talked every day. That's a long period of time to be talking every day, and probably in most of that period of time, multiple times a day. So just the constant contact is indicative of the relationship. But what's really amazing is the constant stream of ideas and issues and information that flows in between. A lot of times candidates will call you, hey, what's going on? What do the numbers say today? And they get satisfied with, they get checked in, and they're off to the races, doing their job, pressing the flesh, talking to reporters, doing campaign activity. John is one of the most intellectually curious people I know. He'd want to know the details of what do I think is happening in the media? How do we think this is going to play in various states? What are the leadership in those states reacting to our most recent proposals? And even if it's not in a campaign period, you know, what do you think was going to happen with the new administration and how we react to it on defense issues? I don't know anything about defense issues, but it would never hesitate John to ask, because I think he wants to know as much as he can from people he trusts, and even if they're not experts on certain subject matter, he wants to hear your views. And he's never, in a single instance that I can recall in all that period of time, ever argued with me over an issue that you know, we were just discussing. It was just a matter of he needed that information. He doesn't taint it in any way. He just takes it in and fleshes around. I don't know where it goes after that, but he would never hesitate to ask. That has not changed. I mean, look, I think that's the hallmark of many great men, public officials of every stripe, is their interest in learning something new every day. And I think John, he's a well-read man. He digs in on the issues. He shows up in the office every morning early to read 4 or 5 papers. You know, he is an incredibly well-read individual, and that's just the beginning of his day. And then he spends the rest of his day talking to experts and, you know, practitioners and friends and, you know, acquaintances and even people on the street. I mean, anybody's views are welcome to him, and how he mixes those up and comes out with the policy prescriptions and the views he has is really uniquely McCain. He's got the greatest sense of humor the first time you meet him, and then after you've heard those jokes 25 times, his sense of humor tends to wane a little bit. Now, he loves a good time. You know, he is someone who likes to relax. There's a lot of tension in his job as a senator, an enormous amount of pressure and tension when he runs for president or for re-election. And he knows better than anyone that he's got to cut that tension somehow. And a sense of humor is always the way to it. I remember it's now Halloween Day, and Halloween in 2008 for the elections, we were in a debate. And Lindsey Graham shows up at dinner right before the debate with a John McCain Halloween mask on. And I mean, the whole dinner, you could cut the pressure going into that dinner. It was a big debate. It was one of the national scale outings. You know, John was tight. We were all tight. It was a must-do. You know, gotta declare victory tonight. And Lindsey Graham walks in with a Halloween mask on, and all of a sudden, all that just melted away. John was able to laugh, enjoy himself, and that's the hallmark, I think, of someone who really understands their place. Right? They don't take it too seriously. It's an amazingly important task to do things like run for president, be a United States senator. But that task can pale compared to the needs of people just to be able to enjoy themselves. Football. He's a sporting nut. I mean, nobody has more detailed knowledge of every sporting event you can imagine than John McCain, and he becomes immersed in them. He knows an enormous amount about boxing. I would say that's probably the sport of his passion. But he loves football, baseball, basketball. The only sport he refuses to watch on television is golf because he says it's just not enough action. Sorry, all you golfers, but John McCain is not watching you every Sunday afternoon. Well, it comes at great cost. Trust is not something that's easily earned. In 1999, when we sat down to talk about what kind of campaign would be different to run for president, one of the things that was the hallmark of that was, let's just tell the truth. Let's have a conversation with voters where we don't try to spin them. In those days, spinning was the phrase that was so popular amongst political operatives. You're going to put some spin on it. We actually had T-shirts that say "spinning is lying," and that's true today. What John McCain wanted to do is have a straight conversation with voters, and that's where the Straight Talk campaign came out of. That we weren't going to rosy coat anything. There was never going to be a day where we could get away with spin. And the only bad periods of the campaign is when we did something out of political expediency rather than just telling the truth. And that's how you build trust. It's a dangerous high wire act where you don't know how voters are going to react to it, but if you stick to it and you make that a standard with which you have a conversation with voters on, then everybody is going to come around sooner or later and say, you know what, I disagree with what he says from time to time, but I trust that what he's telling me is the truth. Planning a presidential campaign is a pretty personal thing. One, you got to decide that you're willing to take the risks. It doesn't always work out well for people. In fact, it only works out well for one person per party. The others who lose tend to lose a lot in their political life cycle, right? The political graveyard is stuck full of candidates who thought, oh, I can't lose a thing by running for president, and then they're gone. So it's a high-risk discussion. It has all kinds of political perils. What if I don't perform well? What if I screw up a debate? What if I, don't get votes? It has a lot of physical peril. It's an enormous task physically to get up every morning at the crack of dawn, to do the early morning TV shows, to get on a plane, to fly around to these little towns, press the flesh all day long, then go to a fundraiser that night, and then start making calls into the next state, or get on a plane and fly there so you're there first thing in the morning. So it takes an enormous time out of your life. The time commitment means time away from your job, time away from your family, time away from the things you love to do. Not that you don't love to run for president, but it's not exactly in the top 10. And so when you start talking about it, you start talking about all those things. You start talking about the toll it'll take on the family, what role the family will play in the campaign. What do you want to say, right? Nobody runs for president unless they actually want to be president and also want to accomplish something. So you talk about what is it that you want to accomplish? What do you want? What's the impact you want to have? Why do this? Put yourself through all this, raise all this money, make all these commitments to people if you don't know what the outcome's going to be. So you want to have all that loaded into the chamber before you fire that gun. And John's very good at that. I mean, he's always had, I think, a desire to use power to improve people's lives. That's what elections give you. If you're successful, you get power. And with power, you can create change. And even though we lost in the primaries in 2000, John McCain went from a guy who nobody really knew other than, there might be this guy named McCain who's a senator from Arizona, or isn't he the guy who was a former POW, very low name ID, to after the primary, which was wildly successful in creating power, but unsuccessful in winning the nomination, he was able to go back to the United States Senate, a much more powerful individual than when he started that campaign, and was able to accomplish great things like campaign finance reform and other things. So, even though you lose, you can lose in a way that gives you more power to accomplish the things you still want to do. In 1999, much like today, there was a need to reform government. We've spent a lot of time not getting things done as a federal government. We had problems with Medicaid and Medicare and Social Security as far as funding. The defense establishment, although built up over Bush, had gone through Gulf Wars and other things that had weakened them. So there was a desire to create a stronger, more nimble, more flexible military. And remember, this is all pre-9/11. So the world was a different place than we know today since then. And I would say, too, create a different discourse. Even in 1999, people were talking about polarization, and that we can't get anything done, and that, it's very hard to get bipartisan legislation passed or, reach across the aisle, that this gulf was getting bigger and bigger and we have to stop it. So the campaign that he ran was much like the administration that he would have overseen, and that was a reform campaign. The idea was, how do we reform government? So our number one campaign theme was campaign finance reform. There's too much money washing around in politics. The $1 million check was still able to be written in those days. And we thought, unless you took that money out, you were never going to get a true political system where bipartisanship could flourish. Two, the entitlements. One of the number one issues that we campaigned on in 2000 was on reforming Social Security. Now, since then, nothing has been done on Social Security, but it was one of the hallmarks of our campaign that Social Security needed to be updated and repaired in order for all those commitments to be able to be sustained over time. So these kinds of things were very popular at the time. We'd seen other campaigns do well on issues related to Social Security. We knew it was a risk. No Republican likes talking about changing entitlements. But our whole campaign wasn't about being a Republican. It was about being honest with voters about what needed to change. Well, in the run-up to the 2000 campaign, there were lots of candidates, I think around 9, and they included a lot of really important people. Elizabeth Dole, who had been a cabinet secretary and wife of a presidential candidate, nominee of the party. Well-known, big contributors list. Lamar Alexander, who'd run before, had a lot of track record, and knew people in Iowa, New Hampshire, Florida, all these places that were important. Folks like that were everywhere. And one, Phil Gramm. No, Phil wasn't in that race. That was 96. Sorry about that. No Phil Gramm in that campaign. But many others. Dan Quayle, I think, had a cameo appearance in the 2000 primary field. And I would say John McCain was probably the least known of any of those candidates. Everyone else had a national name ID, had either run for president or been part of presidential campaigns, and nobody really knew who John McCain was. And of course, the one person that sort of stood over top of that entire field, was George W. Bush, right? Son, governor of Texas, son of the president. President was still, very popular, George H.W. Bush. And so he came into the campaign late. So for many, many months, it was this field of 9 people trying to jockey for position. Our view was just ignore the field, right? There wasn't much we could do to influence the outcome of all those people. What were we going to do to get John McCain better known? And we did something that was quite unique. We took a poll in New Hampshire, and we asked people about John McCain. Nobody really knew who he was. But then we talked about his bio, and we used his bio and a number of other bios of other candidates running and said, if you had to choose between the bios of these people, and we took them all off of their material. It wasn't like we cooked the books. And we really wanted to see, whether or not his bio was something that voters would react to. And all of a sudden we realized we found gold, that people reacted incredibly well to that. His reform message, his history, his commitment to our country as, a pilot in Vietnam, shot down, a POW, and then went right into the politics of business, the business of politics right away, was something that people really liked. And that reform message was very powerful. So our strategy was ignore the rest of the field and put our head down and start selling John McCain. Ultimately, we were able to catch fire at the very end of the campaign. That was the strategy. We didn't have enough money to be popular early. We couldn't have supported it. And literally, the whole idea was just win in New Hampshire, or do extremely well there, and start the campaign basically from there. And that's exactly what we did. We ignored Iowa, first primary caucus in the nation. Everyone says, oh, you can't do anything unless you go to Iowa. We knew that John's bio and his reform message and his background wasn't the perfect match for Iowa, certainly not for the caucuses, which is a real organizational exercise, and we didn't have enough campaign staff to organize a state, and so we just didn't go. The only time John set foot in Iowa in 2000 was for the debates. We thought we'd take advantage of those because they were national events, and we said, we'll meet you all in New Hampshire. And what happened is the rest of the field ground themselves down in Iowa. They weren't able to really catch fire, and it was a real mixed bag. And there was this guy named Huckabee that came out of nowhere and was able to give George W. Bush a real run in Iowa and cause all kinds of commotion at the top of the ticket. And we were ready in New Hampshire the next day. We entered into a new campaign. And by the time people stopped voting in New Hampshire, John McCain had a historic 19-point win. And it was exactly what the strategy was all about. We had no idea we'd get to 19 points as a margin of victory, but we took it and flew south to South Carolina for a 3-week bruising South Carolina campaign. Bill McInturf is an inveterate liar. As a pollster, it's a requirement for the job. They make these numbers up. Now, Bill had been a long time campaign operative for McCain, long before almost anyone else. I think he even polled for John's first congressional campaign, so he knew the guy well. And he knew he didn't like good news. and frankly, we weren't used to good news in a campaign that had never seen a single national poll that had John McCain anywhere but rock bottom. And so when we started getting movement in New Hampshire in November and December of '99, we thought, wow, this is the plan, but we really didn't know whether it would work or not. And I think McInturf had to constantly second guess his own methodology, because what if he's polling the wrong people? What if the mix is different? What if it's not the right turnout model? Bill's very nervous about his numbers because so many people make decisions like me over, how much to spend, where to go, what to do, based on where his numbers are. And I think the pressure, knowing it was a one-state strategy, and those numbers in New Hampshire were everything, really crippled a lot of people. I mean, we were very nervous about whether we were making this bet right. And I remember even on election day in New Hampshire, Bill didn't want to talk to anybody. He didn't want to see anybody. He didn't want to talk about the overnight polling, because at the end of the day, the numbers he was getting were incredibly positive. Nobody in their wildest imaginations would have said that John McCain was going to cruise to a 19-point win. And sure enough, his data and the outcome were pretty consistent. Yeah, I think fetal position in his bedroom in the hotel while everyone was celebrating. And that's right. We were easily 5-10 points down going into the New Hampshire campaign in South Carolina. But I did an interview with Karl Rove the day before the New Hampshire primary, and I said, we're going to beat you in New Hampshire. I bet you a steak dinner that within 24 hours we're winning in South Carolina. Because our whole strategy was that we were betting on the fact that momentum mattered more than the polling data. That if you could beat a sitting, son of a president who had been, up until this point in time, already anointed the Republican nominee. I mean, nobody was supposed to beat George W. Bush. That if you could actually beat him in a state, that it could create an enormous backlash and create enormous momentum for us in any future state. We didn't spend hardly $1 in South Carolina until the day after the New Hampshire primary, and it's exactly what happened. Within 2 days after getting to South Carolina, we were already 5 points up in the surveys. And so that margin of deficit disappeared literally when people counted the votes in New Hampshire. South Carolina was a 3-week campaign. So the schedule in those days was you left New Hampshire and you had 3 weeks to campaign in South Carolina. And it was pretty much the only thing going on. And so we go down and we start campaigning door to door in South Carolina. I mean, it was a real retail campaign. But by now, two things had changed dramatically. One, the crowds were enormous, right? John McCain would roll into Columbia, South Carolina, and 5,000 people would show up in an event that we thought 500 people would show up. So we had a different ride going on. I mean, it was enormously changed. But also what changed is we pioneered internet contributions to campaigns. In fact, earlier in that campaign, the McCain campaign and the Bradley campaign had appealed to the FEC to give us the right to take a credit card contribution that up until that point in time, none had ever been given for political purposes. And so our strategy was, when we win New Hampshire, and we were convinced we were going to win New Hampshire, we have to be able to raise money fast. And one of the ways we believed we would raise money fast is through the internet. But the only way we could get it in the internet is through credit cards, so we had to get that deal done. And we did. What happened the next day? So we arrive in South Carolina, we're on a bus. The night before we arrived, we're on a bus traveling the state, and literally every hour on the hour, our internet receipts for fundraising are going through the moon. We are getting $1 million an hour into the campaign. I mean, this is a campaign that didn't have $10 million total, and we raised $5 million the day after the New Hampshire campaign. And so it was between the fundraising momentum and the momentum we've gotten from crowds showing up at our events that just totally fundamentally changed the way we campaigned and the way John McCain was perceived. It was a one-on-one race at that point. It was McCain versus Bush. And even though there were still some other candidates in the field, nobody cared. It was McCain versus Bush. The high was pretty good. I mean, literally every hour on the hour, my internet folks were calling me saying, okay, we got in another, $500,000, $1 million, $1.5 million. And we were literally announcing it on the bus, and cheers would go up on the bus. Now, the thing you need to understand about that campaign is the bus is about 1/3 campaign staff and 2/3 reporters. And I would say there was as many cheers from the reporters as there were from the campaign team, because in that campaign, it was the Straight Talk Express by now. We had basically modeled the campaign on being completely transparent, and literally every day, 18 hours a day, John McCain would be surrounded by the press corps that was covering him in the back of that bus, holding forth on every issue that was on the table. It could be important national security issues or the latest book read. I mean, it could be what you saw in the movies last night, or what the campaign's doing about the George Bush attack from last night. And so it literally had become an environment all to itself. And as it rolled around South Carolina, there were great times and there were hard times, but it was definitely a culture that was created around the Straight Talk Express. It came together naturally. Over time, when we first started in New Hampshire, it was like a car with 3 people in it. I remember when we had a big moment in the campaign when 3 or 4 national reporters said, hey, we're going to go travel with McCain. We actually got to rent a van because we needed more seats. And so it went from a van then to a bus. And the bus was this freewheeling exercise in public discourse, right? I mean, John McCain sitting in the back of the bus with all these reporters, basically talking about anything that came to their mind. And the routine would be that the reporters would get in there in the morning and they'd ask all the hard campaign questions and then go file their stories. This was in the day before, 24-hour internet service. And then the rest of the day, it would be talking about history or talking about, books and interesting people and articles and their views, way outside the normal political discourse. And so it was just a fascinating, rambling conversation that literally started at 7 o'clock in the morning and many times didn't end until midnight. And really, kudos to the press corps. No gotcha questions, no like, hey, when did you last stop beating your wife? I mean, those things were not allowed on the bus because you didn't want to waste your time with that. You wanted to have a very interesting, intellectually curious discussion with a guy who was full of ideas. And none of it was vetted. I mean, we didn't sit there and hand out policy papers. It was all, top of mind by John McCain, who had the kind of mind and wit and was entertaining that he could actually keep that going for that long a time, every single day. So we get to South Carolina, day after New Hampshire, we're 5 points up. We'd erased a 15-point deficit overnight. We had momentum, the big mo. And we drove that for about the first week of the campaign. But two things started happening. One, we started acting like a real campaign, right? So we started running TV. The money that was coming in every day from the internet was getting thrown up on television that night. Ads were being produced. We were getting into sort of a normal tit for tat, right? Up until this point in time, I don't think a single TV ad had ever been run against John McCain or George Bush by either party. New Hampshire's campaign was basically void of a lot of negative campaigning. By the time we got to South Carolina, it was bare-knuckle politics. We were running negative ads against George Bush. George Bush was running negative ads against John McCain. It was for the fight of the century. Everybody knew in the Bush campaign and the McCain campaign that whoever came out of South Carolina was likely to be the nominee of the party. Even though it was that short a period of time inside the crucible of the primary experience, most of the other campaigns were either broke or exhausted, with support. And these two campaigns had all the energy. The establishment centered around George W. Bush and the reformers centered around John McCain. And one person was going to come out of South Carolina to be the nominee with the money and the support that they needed to be able to win. And so everybody knew that it was all the marbles in South Carolina. And within about 10 days, 7 days out of the campaign, out of the election day, it had gotten totally out of control. The negative advertising was, the worst you've ever seen in your life. It was personal. There were some of the most horrible things said about McCain and his family. The press was picking it up, and the press that had been our ally in the sense that because we gave total access to the press, we got a lot of press. And that had been one of the beneficial aspects of the way we ran the campaign. Now, it actually worked against us because every single charge was vetted on the evening news that night. Oh my God, somebody said John McCain had an African-American baby. Oh, how horrible that is that someone would attack McCain's family when in fact, the McCains had adopted a baby from Bangladesh, when it was an infant because it had a cleft palate and was going to die. And Cindy took the baby in, and yet it was a campaign theme that night. So rather than bury that and not honor it with, attention, the media, was basically a delivery drug for these negative attacks. I remember standing in Columbia, South Carolina, watching a CNN interview of a professor at Bob Jones University who said John McCain had a comfortable life in prison camp and a family. And the CNN interviewer said, well, how can you prove that? And the professor said, how can John McCain prove that it didn't happen? Now, that was on CNN. Now, why would CNN broadcast a completely unsubstantiated attack like that where the prove the negative was now the normal? And so it was getting bad. But one day, what really changed the outcome, in my view, of the campaign was a rally we had in Columbia, South Carolina. It was maybe 10 days into the campaign. And I'd say we'd melted away about 5 point of the 5-point lead. It was about a dead even race. And we were losing ground, not gaining ground. And a person stood up in the crowd, a woman, and this was normal for a McCain rally that people would ask questions. Only guy I know who could go to a rally for 5,000 people and say, anybody's got any questions? And she stood up and she told a story about her son who was, maybe 10 or 11 years old. I don't recall at the time. But he worshiped John McCain, had campaign posters in his room, followed the campaign vociferously, and really, was excited that the campaign had come to South Carolina. But one day had gotten one of these pernicious phone calls that had been going on, talking about John McCain in a very slanderous way, talking about he was a liar, he was a cheat. And the kid had picked up the phone and gotten this message from the recorded caller that was delivering these via mass phone call. Another, attack method that was employed with no fingerprints on it. Nobody knew who made the call or who was behind it, but it was obviously an anti-McCain call. And he was crushed. And he asked his mother that night, "Mom, is John McCain really a liar?" And the crowd silenced. You could hear a pin drop. And the media immediately descended upon her. And John said at the time, this has turned into a negative campaign, never intended to be this way. This is not honoring the voters in any way, shape, or form. We got to do something about it. And so she was on the evening news that night. It was a compelling story to see at home all around the country. But we hopped on a plane and flew to New York for a big fundraiser because not all the money needed to come through the internet. And we were in the hotel, and McCain called me into his suite. And at the time, his daughter, Meghan McCain, was a student at Columbia University. So she was there for the event. And it was a big, splashy affair. I think it was in the New York Hilton Hotel. And she's in there, and he says, "Look, I want to take off all the negative campaign ads. I want to go positive." I said, "Well, what do you mean, take off negative campaign ads? We're in a slugfest of our lives. This is, battle to the death. We got to be able to define George W. Bush. He's defining us in ways that, we can't even retaliate against." And he said, "Nope." He said, "I want to run a campaign that my daughter will be proud of." And I thought at the time, "You're losing the election." And I told him that. I said, "If you go positive, you will lose South Carolina." He says, "It doesn't matter to me. I'd rather lose an honorable campaign than win a dishonorable one." So that night, got the strategy group all on the phone, got our media consultants on the phone, got our ground game on the phone. We had a big huddle, and we pulled the plug. We took our ads down. Took a couple of days to wash them through, but by 2 days after that decision, we had run nothing but positive ads about John McCain, in the face of what has been repudiated over time to be one of the most negative state campaigns in history of any state. And we lost, and we were going to lose. And as McIntyre says, you can't look at the time and day as to when we lost the election, but I would contend that when John McCain said, "Take down the defenses, let's let it ride on a positive campaign," that day is what changed the campaign. We had people on the ground in South Carolina, just like we had in New Hampshire, right? Who know the local issues, understand the local politics. It's all a essential component of any presidential campaign, is to have these folks around. And one of the things that was a hot debate at the time, that had nothing to do with the Republican primary, but was debating actively in South Carolina, was whether or not the flag should fly on the property of the state capitol, the Confederate flag. We all know now today there are a lot of issues related to the Confederate flag, but at that time it was a pretty hot issue in South Carolina. And when you roll into a state like South Carolina, even though you're talking about reforming the federal government and changing Social Security and campaign finance reform, you're going to get asked every single day by state reporters, what do you think about the issue of taking down the Confederate flag? And we consulted, the local group. They were very talented, skilled politicos, and they said, "Look, don't get involved in this issue." And we literally worked out some wording, about the fact that it was a symbol of heritage, and that it was a state issue. And it got to the point where when we sat down and talked to John McCain about it, he's like, "That's bullshit." And we convinced him. We said, "Well, it's a state issue. It's not what we want to get into. Let's just use this spin, right?" And we just talked about spinning as lying. Well, we bought into the lie, and we literally had to write it down on a 3x5 card because he just refused to remember it, right? And here's a guy who's got a memory where he can tell you what's on page 97 of a book, right? And yet he could not articulate this message that we asked him to do. And he didn't want to do it because he didn't believe in it. and yet it was politically expedient to do it, and he did it. I literally remember an interview where he reaches into his pocket, pulls out the card, and just reads the answer when asked the question. And he knew it was the wrong thing to do at the time. It was one of the very few instances where we didn't follow our instincts rather than following the polling data. And I think for that reason, rightly so, he went back after the election and apologized to the people of South Carolina for spinning them and telling them something he didn't believe and didn't think they should either. You wouldn't see that today from anybody. After the event where the woman had discussed, what had happened to her son, we were able to get the two of them together, literally behind the stage. And McCain did call the young boy and told him not to believe what he'd heard, and that he should believe in the symbols that represent John McCain, and that was the kind of heart he had at that time. I mean, it was one of these things where it wasn't just a campaign for president. It was a campaign for his vision of America and what it stood for, and the honesty and integrity that elected officials should want to have if they want to serve as President of the United States. I mean, it was really an ideological campaign. And that little boy just symbolized what was wrong with it. And we couldn't control what the Bush campaign did, but John McCain could control what he did as a presidential candidate and what his campaign did. And many years later, you'll see him referencing the fact that you have to be responsible for your campaign. When things would go wrong in other people's campaigns, he would feel sorry for them, but he would say, you're responsible for what happens in your campaign. Primarily because he made one of the hardest decisions anybody has ever made as a candidate at any level, right? He did something that was honorable, that was actually going to keep him from being able to win the election. And he knew it at the time when he made the decision. We had, we'd all flown in after Super Tuesday. The campaign had gone on successfully in some states and not successfully in others, all the way through Super Tuesday. I think there were 21 states at risk on Super Tuesday. We were in California, and a group of us flew, senior campaign group, to Sedona, Arizona, where John has his hideaway, and a place where he goes to make big decisions, relax with his family, and sort of, repair up in between campaign slogs. And so we were there, and there had already been a good amount of activity done in advance of the trip there to determine just numerically where we stood in the campaign. The view was, let's get through Super Tuesday. There are a lot of delegates at stake. We'll see how it goes, and count up what's left at that point in time. And even though numerically we still had a chance to win John the nomination, it was unlikely, right? I mean, it meant we had to clear the table, and we knew we weren't going to do that. So there was a very honest conversation about what our chances are. And John's view was this was a campaign that was launched to make a point, but that the last thing you would want to do is keep a Republican from winning just because you're making a point within the Republican Party. Again, sort of an honorable approach that we don't want to drain the campaign resources of George W. Bush because he's got a much bigger fight. If we think he's going to be the nominee, he's got a much bigger fight coming ahead of him than winning the primaries. He's got to win the general. And we don't want to do anything that would damage his ability to do that. Now, this is at a time when there had been a lot of bad feelings between the two camps. Very hard campaign that had ensued over the year of campaigning. But John's view was, no, I don't want to continue to campaign if it's futile, and I sure don't want to engage the resources of the Bush campaign and leave them depleted, at the hands of the Democrats, who, had a relatively easy contest that Al Gore had already finished off. So the decision was at that point to get out of the race. There had been a conversation, in all honesty, about how about running for independent. He had garnered a lot of support outside the party, in addition to winning a lot of primaries. with Republican votes, he was very popular with Democrats and independents because the reform message wasn't singular to any one party. But John's a Republican. He's a Teddy Roosevelt, Abraham Lincoln, Ronald Reagan Republican. And the last thing he wants to do is damage the party from being able to carry on those kinds of, I'd say, traditions. You know, in many cases, once you withdraw from a campaign, you sort of lose any real focus of the media or any political saliency. That was not the case with John McCain. The Bush folks wanted his endorsement, and he withheld it for a period of time, both because I think he thought that he needed to let the tempers cool off. It had still been pretty hot between the two camps, so he wanted some time for that to go through. It didn't really matter in the primary anymore. Bush was going to win through these states now that John had taken his name off the ballot. And I think he wanted to focus on what he was going to do next in the United States Senate. He'd gained an enormous amount of power politically around the country, and he wanted to accomplish things on his own, regardless of what happened in the presidential campaign. So immediately, plans got started to put together legislation on campaign finance reform, on climate, on all kinds of different issues related to the military, in order to basically take the momentum that John had gotten through the election process and turn it into legislative victory. So that took some time, and he threw himself into that pretty intensely right after withdrawing from the primary. It wasn't for months before Senator McCain actually had a meeting with President, or then candidate Bush, in Pennsylvania, where they laid down the swords and shook hands and agreed to work together. I would say at that time, it was bittersweet. Some of the issues that John had campaigned on were really picked up by the Democrats who were running against George Bush. Bush had been a late entry to the issues related to campaign finance reform, although he had adopted them because McCain had gotten so much value out of them that he was even running commercials, George H.W. Bush campaign, for campaign finance reform, mimicking the McCain success with some of these issues. But really, it was Gore Lieberman in many cases on climate and on campaign finance reform that really held more common cause with where McCain was. And frankly, I think that was a beginning of a change in the electorate, where if you had to make a choice, where if you were going to be someone who was worried about those kinds of issues, you found more comfort in the Democratic camp than you did in the Republican camp. And not to say that Bush didn't offer other options, at that time to be a Republican. We had the best of both worlds when McCain and Bush were together in this campaign, because both had a good and articulate message on those issues, and frankly stolen away by John's good friend Joe Lieberman and sometimes friend Al Gore. And so later, after the Gore-Lieberman loss, John worked very hard with Joe Lieberman to put together some legislation called cap and trade to help a market solution to climate issues. So it didn't slow them down as people, but it obviously had a big impact, on the presidential electorate. Well, if the 2000 campaign was known as sort of the reformer campaign, and straight talk express and freewheeling, easy access to the media, I would say the 2008 campaign was completely the opposite. We knew times had changed, that maybe we needed to approach the 2008 campaign differently than we did in the 2000 campaign. We knew we'd have access to more resources, money, and people. And we had a lot of time to think about it. John McCain was in sort of political winter during most of the Bush administration. He wasn't the popular Republican. even though he had enormous popularity with the electorate, inside of Washington, he was never considered part of the Bush administration team. In fact, if anything, he was sort of the outsider within a Republican administration. So really, the 2000 campaign and the 2008 campaign were night and day. The 2000 campaign, known for its rollicking style, freewheeling with the press, reform message, turned into an establishment message with a big control campaign. And 2008, we took a lesson from the success of the George W. Bush campaign and said, we want the resources, we want the manpower, we want the battleship that lasts the test of time and can deliver a win at all costs versus taking a lot of risks along the way. So early on in 2006, we started planning a battleship where Senator McCain would have access to big donors all over the country, lots of money, a big organization to raise those funds and deliver them, but even a bigger organization to spend them. Campaign managers, teams in every state, 50-state campaign, all the things we used to laugh about as suckers. They're having to spend money in states that you're never going to wind up campaigning in. We did exactly that, and we felt at that time that maybe that was the new normal. That if you didn't have that kind of big establishment vehicle to support all the people who wanted to have John McCain as president at this point, you ran the risk of someone doing what we almost did to George W. Bush, which is come in and snatch the prize away from them. So we built that battleship. John announced, that he was running, and the day he announced, he was the leader of the pack of presumptives and had more money and more likelihood of success than any other individual. So he was overnight the establishment. And I would say John McCain was much more comfortable as the guy throwing rocks at windows, as the reformer outsider from 2000, than he was wearing the mantle of a Republican Party in a Republican administration, acting as the vehicle for the establishment to win another victory. And that was the 2008 campaign. There was no question that after the 2000 loss, there was really no sense that there was a prospect for John to ever run for president again. And so in 2006, discussions started with John himself. Did he have a platform? What did he want to accomplish? How old he was. He would have been the oldest president to be elected at that time. And he wanted to make sure he had the stamina. It was a big difference, between being in your 70s, and 80s. And so, I think those are really important things that weighed on his mind. And in the family, they had been through a bruising political experience in 2000. Getting them on board and seeing whether or not they were up for another election was a whole nother series of conversations. I remember being out in San Diego, California, Coronado, where the McCains have a condominium, and having a one-on-one meeting with Cindy to go through the likelihood that John may want to run for president again. And basically, Senator said, I'll take it seriously if Cindy's okay. And he didn't want to be the guy to make that pitch, because I think he thought that would make it hard for her to say no. So I was the sucker that got sent out there, because everyone says no to me. And Cindy could not have been more constructive. There were issues that she knew that were going to come up because of her experience on the campaign trail, that she wanted assurances that the family could be protected, frankly, in a better way than it was in 2000. And I think that took a very mature and I think, very strategic look at the race, both as a mother and as a wife and as a public servant herself. 9/11 had a profound impact not only on the country and security and the subsequent wars in Afghanistan and Iraq, but also on the American electorate, right? We cared about things that we didn't used to care about. Now, that was a wonderful opportunity for Senator McCain, who had always been steeped in national security, foreign policy, national security affairs, and so he was, I think, legitimately the right man at the right time to lead a nation in a post 9/11 environment. And I think the early polling demonstrated that. He was significantly in the lead, both against his likely Republican challengers, but also in many polls against any Democratic opposition that we would have seen at the time. And of course, at this time, it was John McCain and Hillary Clinton. That was the narrative of the 2008 campaign. Little did we know that narrative would be turned upside down. Well, I think that the internet and social media, the impact it had was to just involve more people on a more rapid basis. We thought that was a huge advantage for Senator McCain. He was the kind of person who could react to questions on the stump. He had an enormous amount of experience and information. He was, one of these people who did extremely well on morning shows and interviews because he had at his fingertips, a wealth of knowledge, not only, that he had learned over time in the experience of being a United States Senator, but also, as an individual served in the military and just as an incredibly intellectually curious person, who reads constantly and can recite what he'd picked up along the way. So to us, the speed of the internet was actually keeping pace with the speed of John McCain and his thoughts. I would say the impact, how it actually played out, was different than what we thought. And what had happened is, rather than having a discourse in the back of a bus for 18 hours, like we did in the 2000 campaign on issues that you could get into the depth of them and the nuances of them, we were into gotcha journalism at this point in 2008. That the only thing that you wanted was a certain number of characters to fit into a tweet, or a certain number of seconds in a video that you would then put out virally. It was actually shortened the conversation significantly rather than deepening it. And I'd say that wound up becoming a more difficult way for John McCain to communicate to voters, because he wasn't given the time to really give you the nuance and to give you the depth of the knowledge that he had. And so it was harder for him to convey his competitive edge over other candidates who, frankly, the rise of Barack Obama was the rise of, the set speech and the, sort of set message perfect for the internet. It was a long time before Barack Obama became a serious candidate, for president. And I would say the media had already changed long before he showed up on the scene. One, budgets were tighter in these newspapers and media outlets around the country. So instead of sending senior political reporters to cover the candidates nonstop, like what we saw in 2000, in many cases, newspapers no longer existed that covered us in 2000, and the budgets for those outlets had been diminished so much that in many cases those experienced political reporters were no longer working at those outlets, or the people that were assigned to go out with the campaigns were much more junior, inexperienced reporters who were going to cut their teeth on getting that soundbite or getting that video. We noticed in the bus early activity that instead of people with pads writing out, what they were taking from the conversation and filing their stories, everyone had a camera, and the entire bus was videotaped, and that was the filing, was the video. Now, we had never put makeup on John McCain in the back of a bus in 2000, right? Unless it was a set interview. We had never seen the kind of viral video explosion that would happen if there had been a minor miscue in the course of a bus ride in 2000, because you had 18 hours to clean it up. If people are filing their stories as your bus is rolling along down the street because they can upload it to the internet and have it virally exposed to the world within seconds, It changed the entire dynamic of the kinds of questions, the kinds of discussion, and frankly, the way the media operated. And that was both on airplanes and in the buses and at press conferences. And finally, we came late to the game and realized we have to treat the press in a different fashion. One of the issues of the campaign, even later as Barack Obama became more successful in the Democratic primary, was the fact that we were giving the media enormous amount of access to Senator McCain, and it was negative coverage, and yet Obama was not giving access to the media hardly at all to him and his campaign, and he was getting enormously positive coverage. Some of that just has to do with the swinging pendulum of the taste of the media, but also we realized you didn't get any benefit anymore from that access. In essence, it was counterproductive, and we actually started cranking down on it a little bit. I think in the general election, we had really high hopes. We started the campaign coming out of the convention 5 points up. We were really happy with the success that we had with the convention and the run-up to that with the selection of Sarah Palin as vice president. And literally for 2 weeks, we had a campaign that was winning the presidential election in every survey that we've seen around the country. And certainly in our own data, we saw a lot of strength. One of the things that was the key to us in the convention to come out in the fall campaign was to be able to regain the mantle of the maverick. Just by becoming the nominee of the party, he looked like the establishment personified, right? I mean, he was all of a sudden no longer the maverick, no longer the Straight Talk Express. He was a Republican nominee, and it made him very Republican. And at a time when his numbers had always been good with Democrats and independents and always a little iffy with Republicans, Republicans were bought on to the McCain campaign. 90% supported him in his quest for presidency, and we had lost the bottom of that independent and Democratic support that had been the hallmark of his image for most of that decade going up to that. So we had a different kind of campaign. You know, we had to go out and find votes, in small quantities, and we were doing that. I'd say on September 16th, the entire campaign changed, and that was the day that the economy collapsed. That was the week that the House Republicans voted against the TARP bailout. That was the week, one day, the market crashed 780 points. And from that point on, every speech, every discussion, every event had on the little corner of the screen in every television in every household in America a copy of the Dow Jones Industrial Average and what it was doing that day. And you literally would sit in your office and watch a speech being given by Senator McCain and worrying about whether the Dow was going up or down. And at that time, in middle of September, it was always going down. We lost trillions in market cap. People were being thrown out of their jobs. We were going through a global upheaval that we'd never seen before, the Depression, and we were running a presidential campaign right in the middle of it. And not only we were running a presidential campaign in the middle of it, we were running an incumbent Republican administration campaign. I mean, John McCain and George Bush had never really been that close. You know, they'd fought on a lot of issues throughout the year, but they'd found détente in the later years of the Bush administration. And Bush was very supportive of McCain's task to become his successor as President of the United States. The downside is George Bush was the single least popular sitting president in history. We talk a lot about presidential popularity these days, but George Bush's numbers, his approval rating was 25%. No one has been within 10 points of that in history. It was a combination of factors of the stewardship of the economy and it imploding at the time. The wars in Iraq and Afghanistan had gotten to be a burden for his administration. And we were the third term of the Bush administration. And many voters, they just couldn't shake that. Like every campaign, we win a relatively early primary victory, and we have some time now to figure out how we're going to wage the general election. One of the most critical decisions that John McCain had to make was who was going to be his running mate. And we had a lot of good options, at least we thought we did. We put a list together of about 25 people, and Senator McCain and the strategists around him and the family whittled that down to about a dozen, and we went through the vetting process. And out of that dozen, came about another half a dozen, and we started the process of sort of a deep dive. And what that meant was we did survey research around these folks, and we were looking at people who came from wildly different walks of life. Everybody from Michael Bloomberg to Mitt Romney, and what we found in this group of all men was that they didn't help us with any of the constituents that we needed to broaden the base of our party, to broaden the base of our campaign in order to win the election. So we could govern with any one of these individuals. They would be fine as vice presidential candidates, but they were not likely to help us win the election. And this was at a time in the summer when arguably John McCain's poll numbers opposite Barack Obama were somewhere between down 10 points and down 15 points. We thought it was a good day when we were only down 10 points. And so we presented this information to Senator McCain, and the conclusion was all these people were good and fine folks. They passed through our rigorous background checks, but none of them are particularly going to be helpful in getting you elected. With them on the ticket, you're on your own. And so Senator McCain said, well, what's the group that I'm most in need of? And we said women. At that time, John McCain had a net positive image amongst white male voters of plus 28. He was very popular. But he was a negative 15 amongst white women. And that was the critical sort of feature of what we were trying to determine as to how to balance that out. How do you get more white women into our election formula without losing, the white males? And there's issues, obviously, that you can tackle. But one of the things that Senator McCain said, well, let's look at more women, as potential candidates for vice president. And so we did. And out of that analysis came Sarah Palin. Maverick like him out of Alaska, 85% approval rating amongst the voters there, had never spent any time really in the lower 48 doing politics, but had beat a Republican scion of the family to be governor, and was a favorite amongst conservatives, within the party. And as you can imagine, that was sort of an added benefit since McCain was always suspect amongst conservatives within the party. But what we liked about the energy around Sarah Palin was that she was a maverick, and we knew we had to get back that maverick appeal that John McCain had won so many campaigns previously with that had been washed away since becoming the nominee of the party. And so John McCain picked Sarah Palin. And from the day the world even heard her name, which was the day after the Obama convention, just to dial it back a minute, Obama went into his convention with at least a 10-point lead, maybe 15-point lead. It was one of the most successful conventions the Democratic Party has ever held. The Obama speech accepting the nomination of his party in an open stadium with 100,000 people with Greek columns surrounding him was carried live around the world. Our guess, the next morning we woke up that Friday, and we were probably 15 to 20 points down. Usually get a bump out of your convention. I'm sure that Barack Obama got a bump out of his convention. At 11 o'clock the next morning, Friday morning, in Dayton, Ohio, John McCain stood on a stage with Sarah Palin, who no one had ever heard of other than in Alaska, and announced that she was going to be his vice presidential running mate. She didn't do another interview or another speech until Wednesday at the convention, 5 days later, where she introduced herself to the American public. The highest ranking convention audience in history at that time, 65 million people watched her speech. That Friday, our pollster, Bill McInturff, gave me a survey that showed that we had erased a 20-point margin where we went from 15 points down to 5 points up. And the only fundamental change in the campaign at that time was 2 speeches by Sarah Palin. Now, I would argue, I think the John McCain speech on Thursday night was a humdinger, and he inspired people and probably added to that number. But at the end of the day, you can't doubt the facts. And the facts are that Barack Obama finished his convention an overwhelming leader of the presidential campaign and woke up a week later trailing. And that's just the facts. John McCain has the right to be nostalgic, right? I mean, he's not going to change the outcome of the 2008 presidential campaign. He's not going to change the fact that, you know, he selected Sarah Palin, and he can't change the fact that, you know, Joe Lieberman would have been an enormous wild card, you know, is getting Republican unity and even picking up any Democratic or independent votes, which none of the surveys indicated he would. But he's his friend, you know, and I know John McCain, and John McCain loves his friends. And you want to be on the friend category, not the enemy category. And for that reason and that reason alone, you know, for the rest of John's life, I'm sure he'll entertain thoughts that if I were president, you know, what would it have been like to have Joe Lieberman serve? I can tell you without a shadow of doubt that if John McCain had become president of the United States, most of what we today know about Sarah Palin would have been erased by history, because she would have been in a different job that many lesser individuals have had and done just fine in. And I think she would have been supportive of Senator McCain 100% of the time. And so history will never allow us the opportunity to look into that cloud and see, you know, how it worked out. And you can't erase today the differences of Sarah Palin, the vice presidential nominee of the Republican Party, and what she's become politically today. But I can tell you for sure that forever, John McCain will value his relationship with Joe Lieberman and has the right, all he wants, to think about how romantically fun that would have been to have had him, you know, also as a nominee for vice president. We had that discussion pretty vociferously, you know, around the table, and you know, John is a smart man. He understands what it takes. And look, here's the fundamental way you pick a vice president, right? If you're in the lead, you pick someone you want to serve with. And that's how Joe Biden got selected by Barack Obama. Joe Biden wasn't going to add 1 vote to the Obama coalition, but he's a nice guy. He's the kind of guy you want to walk in and see every day hanging around the office. But when you are 10 or 15 points behind, you have to take into the calculus somebody who will help you win. And you hope that if you win, you'll work out how that whole VP presidential thing is going to work out. And it happens every time. There's never been an exception to that rule. You never vote for the guy who's going to be your pal if he doesn't add to the winning coalition. And that's just the fact of how presidential campaigns tend to evolve. Sarah had a profound impact on the campaign because of her immediate popularity. We were used to a certain tempo with Senator McCain, you know, crowd size, schedule, activities, that kind of thing. And when we'd originally designed a vice presidential team, you know, it was basically to focus on fundraising and second-tier states, which would be a traditional way to look at how the vice presidential candidate would operate. Cheney, Jack Kemp, they all had sort of the smaller plane, the, you know, second-tier states, and a lot of fundraising chores, because you wanted to save the other stuff, you know, for your presidential candidate. Immediately, we realized that Palin was going to have a much bigger audience than what we had anticipated for any normal vice presidential nominee. So we beefed up the staff, we beefed up the plane, we beefed up the schedule in a way that would, I think, maximize her growing appeal. And I would say it grew fast. What would normally be a decent day where John McCain would go out and, you know, see 3 big crowd events, you know, 5,000 to 10,000 people, apiece. Sarah Palin would show up in a town that was half the size of the cities that McCain was going to and have 25,000 people there without even batting an eye. She did one event in Florida where 70,000 people showed up, twice what we thought was going to show up that day. So we had to constantly accelerate what we were doing as far as the support staff, the advance people, the events people, the support staff around Palin, just to get that traveling show organized enough to be able to accommodate the massive growth in the activity around her. And you know, the good news is that the McCain team, you know, had been born out of all kinds of anxiety and disruption, and so they were very sort of honed together as a team, and could literally almost operate on their own as a separate campaign. And so the campaign had an advantage of having a real seasoned group that knew the routine and understood, you know, how the McCain campaign functioned well to be able to operate alongside of that. Since 2000, the #1 campaign feature of every McCain campaign, and I would say that includes all his re-elections to the Senate, is doing town halls. Now, most candidates don't like town halls, right? They don't like that kind of Q&A. It can be dicey. They don't like unscripted events. If anything, most candidates usually, you know, say, turn in your cards with your questions, and I'll pick the ones I want to answer. Well, not McCain, right? It's free, no holds bar, you know, free speech. Usually in events like the one in Minnesota, it starts out with protesters, you know, who come and they want to be heard. Of course, we had a lot of protesters on the war in Iraq and Afghanistan, and McCain would always go first to the protesters. If you were a protester, you knew you were going to get the first question. But it was a tactic by John, because then he could say, okay, now you've had your say, sit down and let everybody else now have a conversation. And 9 times out of 10, that worked great, and it would settle a crowd down. In this case, we had a bigger than usual town hall. I mean, typically a town hall would be anywhere on this campaign from 1,000 to 5,000 people. I think close to 10,000 people were in the room. And it was a raucous group, right? They don't normally get that much attention up there, and so you know, I think they were pretty excited to see John McCain there. And it had gotten heated, right? The campaign was stoking up with Barack Obama, and people's, I think, emotions were running hot at this time. And a woman stood up, and she started to take on Barack Obama. And it wasn't the first time John McCain had heard, you know, Barack Hussein Obama slurs at his events and things like that. And 9 times out of 10, he can tamp those down and move on. But in this case, you know, he wanted to make a point. You know, he'd seen the campaign become negative, never a tactic that he particularly liked. And he decided to have a conversation about why that's the wrong thing to do. And he went out of his way to say Barack Obama is a good family man. He's a good man. You know, he'll make a good leader. But the one thing we will not accommodate in this campaign are slurs against him and his family. And this is in a very tough environment. Now, that's the decency of John McCain, right? That's just being a normal human being, a decent human being, void of any political pretense whatsoever, like I'm actually trying to win a race for president. And that's what he does all the time. And it wasn't a surprise to any of us, you know, who have gotten to know him and realize that he doesn't freeze in a moment like that. He uses it as a teaching moment. I hope the rest of this crowd learns that this is not the politics that we try to promote in our country. I'd seen him do it in 2000 in New Hampshire, a state we desperately needed to win. We were in the upstate portion, which was full of textile mills and things that were all disappearing because of the new economy and what was happening in the region. And a man stood up and he said, Senator McCain, if you're elected president, these mills will go away, and where will my son and daughter earn a living? And John looked at him and said, I would have hoped that you'd have a bigger ambition for your son and daughter than working in a textile mill. Now, you tell me what is more critical to the outcome of election than going into upstate New Hampshire and talking about how your kid should have a bigger ambition than working in a textile mill to a guy who you're there to solicit his support. Now that was in 2000, and it's the same kind of an event and the same kind of quick thinking and the same kind of, sort of values-based conversation that McCain would have with voters all the time. These were not, unusual circumstances on a campaign with John McCain. Yeah, I think that probably the greatest way that the campaign changed Senator McCain is it refocused his attention in the Senate. I think the Senate has always been a great passion of his. It's a great body where things can get done. He honors the Senate a great deal with his participation in it. But I think that what he realized was that that was the end of his presidential ambitions. And that, thank God I have the Senate to dive back into. And again, like he did in 2000, use his newfound celebrity status, his newfound political power to try and make change. And literally, the week after the election, he was at work in the United States Senate, traveling all over the world, giving speeches, about the importance of national security, foreign policy issues, and has not missed a beat since the day after that campaign. And for Barack Obama, in many cases, he was his best friend on some issues and his worst enemy. And he treated Barack Obama just like he treated George W. Bush, just like he treated William Clinton. I mean, these guys got the John McCain United States Senator that you get every time. When I agree with you, I'll say so regardless of the political calculation. And when I disagree with you, I'll be your worst enemy in the United States Senate. And that's John McCain. What's interesting about John McCain is everyone always talks about this tough John McCain, right? And for sure, there are moments when, if you're a witness at a congressional hearing that John McCain is running and you don't tell him the truth, you're going to witness the wrath of John McCain because he believes that the only thing you have to bring with you to a United States Senate hearing is the truth. So yes, he has a reputation to be a tough guy, but some of the most tender moments of emotion and understanding I've ever seen in public life have been with John McCain. I don't think you could have led the life that he lived and has lived without having that piece of you keep you going in the hard times. Oh yeah, well the entire 2000 campaign we dubbed the crying campaign because when John McCain got up to speak to voters, he talked to them about their values. He talked to them about what was at stake. It was a different time then, pre-9/11, but every single time it ended with a story of great heroism or sacrifice that he'd witnessed personally himself, either in captivity or subsequent to that. And nobody in the crowd was immune to the emotion, the raw emotion of those moments. And 9 times out of 10, thunderous applause would be followed by wiping of eyes. And literally, we could stand in the back of the room, hardened campaign professionals ourselves, and drop in tears all along the way. And we literally knew that if we were going to have a good event, it was going to result in everybody crying at the end of that campaign event. I can honestly say that I've witnessed the temper, but never focused on me. I have been blessed with a relationship with Senator McCain where I got the best side of him 100% of the time. But sure, he believes that things have a cost, right? And everything is at stake on some of these big moments like presidential campaigns or important debates in the Senate. And he does not take lightly, his view of making sure there's an outcome for the American people there. And he will not suffer fools gladly. And that's when you see the temper. We all have it. Rarely are we on display 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, like an individual like John McCain. So nobody's going to notice it with us. So I do think he gets a lot more attention to the temper than he probably deserves. But it's a passion to him. You know, he doesn't take this stuff lightly. And I think that the American public gets their money's worth with John McCain. I was in L.A., Los Angeles, having lunch, and he had gone into the Mayo Clinic in Scottsdale, Arizona, to get a checkup. And one of the things they were going to do is an MRI. And he'd been complaining of, you know, sleep loss and things like that. So it was, you know, a little bit more than a normal checkup, I would say. And so I'm in the middle of lunch, and I get a call from Senator McCain. And in a very nonchalant way, he says, you know, I had my checkup today, and I'm just about here in Sedona. He was in a car driving to Sedona. Treacherous roads to Sedona, and he's making phone calls, bad boy. And he said, they just called me and tell me to turn my car around and come back. You know, I've got to have something looked at. I'm like, well, what do you mean turn your car around and go back? And he explained to me that something had shown up on the MRI, and that they were potentially going to do surgery that night. Didn't exactly know what it was on. He isn't a very good conveyor of details about himself, but I knew it was important enough to look into it right away. So while he was driving back to Sedona, from Sedona to Scottsdale, I contacted the folks at the hospital and his staff who'd been with him there, and found out that indeed they'd found what looked like a tumor. They didn't know what it was, but they knew it was in a place where he shouldn't have it. And they were going to operate on him that night, and they were assembling the team literally while he drove back to take him straight into surgery. So when I called him back and I said, okay, you know, now I know what you're talking about. You all right? And he goes, yeah, I'll be fine. And so that was when I learned about it. And he was driving himself back to the hospital to have brain surgery. In all these cases where there's a surgery, and then there's like a period of time when you have to sort of find out what they took out of your head, in his case, you know, there's a question. Is it bad? Is it really bad? Is it horribly bad, right? It's never a good thing. And the doctors at the time, the day he woke up, didn't know whether it was a blood clot or whether it was a tumor that could have been melanoma, because in that side of his face, almost 9 years earlier, he'd had some major surgery to take out melanoma. So they thought, well, maybe it's melanoma that had gotten in there, or worse, in this case, like a glioblastoma, which it wound up being. They didn't know. They hadn't done a pathology report. It would take days to do that. And so you can imagine a blunt, straight, you know, black and white kind of guy like John McCain who says, okay, what's the deal? And you have these incredibly smart, super educated, highly trained neurosurgeons saying, well, it could be this, it could be that, it could be another thing. Didn't sit well with Senator McCain. You know, he wanted to know, you know, look, I just, you know, emergency brain surgery. I wake up and I want to know what happened to me. And the doctors, rightly so, they didn't know, right? They weren't sure. They could guess, but the minute you start guessing with a patient like John McCain, he's going to hold you to it. And I think over time, the doctors got to know John and got more information about his condition, and were able to have that sort of straight talk conversation with him. But I would say that was the toughest that I saw for him, was just not knowing, you know, what your real condition was. That he could take that it was bad. It was just like, just tell me and I'll absorb it. He certainly had a lot of bad news in his lifetime. And, you know, the last thing he wanted to do was to be spun. He's had his head radiated for 6 weeks and 7 weeks of chemotherapy. and all the other and sundry things, steroids and diet and things like that. So nobody comes out of that experience, either happy or physically in good shape, right? Now, John McCain has a capacity to bury his own physical limitations like no one you've ever met. He walked out of the hospital at 2 o'clock in the afternoon the day after he got out of brain surgery at 11 o'clock the night before. Nobody's ever done that in the Mayo Clinic in Scottsdale, Arizona. But he felt fine. Now, did he feel fine, or did he convince you that he felt fine? He could answer all the questions the doctor said. He was, eating well. He exhibited all the outward emotions and intellect and physicality of a healthy person 8 hours after he had brain surgery. So they let him go home. I was like, go home? I think they're probably tired of him. But you never know, right? I mean, here's a guy who's gone through enormous physical challenges early in his life and has found a way to accommodate them. His knees are all busted up, but he outwalks everybody who ever tries to do a campaign event with him. His shoulders don't function properly. He can't comb his own hair, but he gets by through the day looking just fine, right? I mean, and you never, ever hear a single word from him about, boy, my knee is really sore today, or my shoulders are killing me, or I didn't get a good night's sleep, or, that food really upset my stomach. Not one single time does he let any of his physical limitations get in the course of a day. And this is the same thing. Just because he's had 7 weeks of, chemotherapy and 6 weeks of radiation and all these other drugs that help cure him of the disease that's attacking him, he'll not let it get in the way of his day. Now, there are limitations that he has today that he didn't have 2 months ago, but he doesn't let them get in the way of his day. Well, it was the kind of thing where it was a good example of John McCain not knowing his own impact. We'd been talking about getting him back. He's been talking about coming back, right? As far as he was concerned, he should get in a car and drive back immediately, just because the doctors had been telling him, hey, you got this hole in your head and you don't want to get on an airplane. Air pockets expand and contract. And so they banned him from getting on a plane for a couple weeks. He was ready to get back to Washington and go to work. He wanted to get back into the groove. Like after failed campaigns for president, he wanted to get back in the Senate and get back to work. That was his therapy, best therapy ever created, the United States Senate. But we tried to explain to him that this was a big deal, him coming back. The entire world knew that he had a brain tumor, and that he was coming back at a time that was highly charged political atmosphere, and it was going to have a bigger impact than just showing up to work again. And I think in his mind, he thought it was just business as usual, right? I'll just get back, we'll get into the rough and tumble of this vote. And we said, no, you want to take an opportunity to try and do something with the attention that you're going to get because of the condition you're in, and you ought to try to change, the attitude of your fellow members of the United States Senate and politics in general. So he sat down and we worked through a speech that did just that. And so I would say even flying up to Washington that day on the plane, we were talking about just the steps that we're going to be going through. You're going to get in a car when you get to National Airport. And they're going to take you straight to the Capitol. You're going to walk in, and they will be immersed in a debate about health care reform. But the Senate will go into recess in order for you to address the entire United States Senate. Why would they do that? I said, well, John, because they expect you back and they expect you to say something to them. They're wanting to hear from you. And I said, you will receive a standing ovation from 99 other senators who will all be assembled. No, the room will be half empty. Nobody will be in there. I said, John, you don't understand. People are there to welcome you back. And so I think he was more shocked by the fact that there were all these people there. They all greeted him, enthusiastically, than any reaction to the speech. I think it's so unusual for a senator to yield time to another senator without walking into the cloakroom or going off to do an interview or meeting with their staff. And nobody did that. They stayed there and listened to John McCain. It's hard not to be proud of John McCain, right? He takes chances that nobody else takes, both with his health, to get on a plane and go to Washington to have an impact. He takes chances with his message, to tell people what they probably need to hear but don't ever want to hear. And he does it all because of his insatiable desire to have an impact for the positive. It's hard not to be respectful of that guy. I think too many people make too much about John McCain and the current relationship he has with Donald Trump. John McCain was George W. Bush's worst enemy in the United States Senate in 2001. He voted against the tax cuts. He voted against virtually everything Bush did. It was in the front page of the newspaper all the time. He was a much better advocate for opposition to George W. Bush than the entire Democratic Party was. Barack Obama gets elected president, invites John McCain to the inaugural himself, and he attends. What happens? John McCain becomes the #1 critic of Barack Obama and his health care plan and many of the other things he did, national policy, foreign policy, national security. So what's the difference today? Probably the difference is Donald Trump fights back. I mean, part of the new dynamic isn't that a senator like John McCain stands up in the well Senate and attacks the president on the policies that he has, but that the president then engages in a Twitter war, with that individual as a response. That's what's different. It's not that John McCain has changed. It's that Donald Trump is a different kind of president. Well, John McCain has given so many wonderful speeches. They still show new recruits at the Naval Academy a speech he gave 20 years ago at the Forrestal series, one that he just reprised last night. I probably shouldn't talk about dates. But there are many. His concession speech in 2008 has been considered one of the great speeches for the transfer of power ever given. So I would say part of what makes the Liberty speech so impactful is that it's a message to the world about how we are supposed to get along with each other. So it's a much broader message than I think traditionally given, even though it's in the context of the U.S. political system. It's applicable everywhere. But also at a time when there are so many questions about where we're going, as people in a fight politically to find space. And it does it at a time, when he knows there's a sunset on his time on earth. And he has very few things to say or time to say. And it has that value, it has that impact. And he's always known how to use the new power he's gotten from presidential campaigns, the excitement of what he's been able to do on issues, and in this point in time, the attention he's getting because of his struggle against cancer to try and create good. Him, his presence.